Ok, ¿qué tal? Buenas tardes a todos. Ya estamos transmitiendo en vivo esta que es nuestra 12ª sesión del Seminario Internacional dedicado a la teoría crítica de Herbert Marcuse. No, nos da mucho gusto contar en esta ocasión con el profesor Arnold Farr de la Universidad de Kentucky. We are very happy to have you here, Professor Arnold Farr, from the University of Kentucky. Su comunicación, su ponencia se va a titular Between Authoritarianism and Democracy, the Relevance of Marcuse Then and Now. Lo que vamos a hacer pues es escuchar la intervención del profesor Arnold Farr. Antes de empezar, voy a leer una pequeña semblanza en español que Berenice muy amablemente nos hizo favor de pasar al español. Y aprovecho yo también en lo personal para agradecerte, Bere, por la coorganización del seminario, por aquí lograr invitar al profesor Farr. Professor Farr, I'm gonna read in Spanish your resume. So then after that, you can start. Okay? So, les leo un poco del trabajo del profesor Arnold Farr. Es profesor de filosofía en la Universidad de Kentucky desde el 2008. Es director del programa de estudios africanos. Cuenta con maestría y doctorado también por la Universidad de Kentucky. Enseñó en el Departamento de Filosofía de la Universidad Saint Joseph en Filadelfia, esto de 1996 a 2008. Es cofundador y primer presidente de la Sociedad Internacional Herbert Marcuse, esto en 2005. Desde 2008 trabaja en el Departamento de Filosofía de la Universidad de Kentucky. Es autor de el libro Teoría Crítica y Visión Democrática, Herbert Marcuse y las Filosofías de la Liberación Recientes, publicado por Lexington Books. Está por publicarse su libro Teología Revolucionaria, Poder Negro y la Visión Profética de James H. Cone para Estados Unidos. Ha publicado numerosos capítulos de libros y artículos, destacando los siguientes. Epílogo, El gran rechazo en una sociedad unidimensional, esto con Andrew Lamas. En el gran rechazo, en el libro El gran rechazo, Herbert Marcuse y los movimientos sociales contemporáneos, un libro editado por Andrew Lamas, Todd Wolfson y Peter Funke en la Universidad de eh, Filadelfia, Roma, Tokio. Em, en el Handbook of Marxism, en Post-Marxism, editado por Alex Kalínicos, Statis Kouvelakis y Lucía Pradella. También, cuando los movimientos de liberación se vuelven unidimensionales, sobre la teoría crítica y la interseccionalidad, con Amalia Perry Farr y Luisa Perry Farr en New Political Science. Esto en 2017. Occupy Technology, una lectura marcusiana sobre la relación entre la tecnología y el potencial de la vida social. Esto publicado en 2017. Rechazando a Whitefield y repensando a Marcuse, 50 años después del hombre unidimensional y otras cosas. Esto en Logos, primavera de 2015. Sus intereses de investigación incluyen el idealismo alemán, el marxismo, la teoría crítica, la filosofía de la raza, el postmarxismo, el psicoanálisis y la filosofía de la liberación. Okay, Professor, welcome. Thank you for being here with
Thank you.
us. Usually, our you have like an hour and a half to talk. You can feel free to talk to think, and you have an hour and a half, and then we have a half an hour to discuss for the questions from our public, so from our audience. So thank you for being here. So the microphone is yours. Thank you.
But thank you. Thank you all so much. Thank you for the um, introduction. Thank you for the invitation. I've been looking forward to this. And thank you all for being here. You could be anywhere else on a Friday night, but you chose to be here. So I hope you're not disappointed. I've been looking forward to this for a while. I started a couple of years ago. I've been working on, as you see from my CV, I've been working on Marcuse for some time and on the Frankfurt School for some time. And a couple of years ago, turned my attention toward authoritarianism and fascism. And I'm presently writing a book on fascism now. And this presentation tonight is a part of that book that I'm working on fascism. And the subtitle was Marcuse, the relevance of Marcuse, then and now. I might drop that from the subtitle because this paper tonight is just as much from as it is Marcuse. I think those are two of the most helpful thinkers in terms of my trying to think through the rise of authoritarianism in this present moment. So I'm eager. I gave 3 lectures in Brazil in the summer of 2024 on authoritarianism, and I'm eager to give these kinds of presentations and get feedback to see if I'm going in the right direction. So I trust you for some constructive criticism tonight. I began in the first part of the paper, though, before getting into Marcuse and Fromm, talking a little bit about Iris Marion Young, who was an American critical theorist and social theorist who passed away untimely in 2006 from breast cancer. Um, but she was very much influenced by the Frankfurt School, and I would argue that she is third generation Frankfurt School critical theorist. And I teach her works from time to time in my class. And I've been very influenced by her book, Inclusion and Democracy, and I begin with that because she clarifies for me what it takes to have a democracy, right? And so before getting into the criticisms of our present democracy and what's wrong with it, Iris Young does a nice job in laying out some criteria for determining whether or not we actually have a democracy. So I begin with just a little bit of that. So with that, I'll begin reading the paper. Democracy is hard to love. This is the first sentence in the first chapter of Iris Young's great book, Inclusion and Democracy. It seems strange that such a statement would be made by a woman who was a U.S. citizen. However, Young goes on to describe the kind of work that is required for a real functioning democracy, instead of what Herbert Marcuse calls a pseudo-democracy. Democracy is not something that you simply have. Rather, it is a political system that must constantly be worked on over time. This means then that democracy, at its best, is an experiment that could possibly fail at any moment. In her book, Young goes on to explain the kind of daily work that democracy requires. For now, I simply want to examine the necessary components of a democratic society as laid out by Young. I would then argue that if certain conditions are not met, then any democratic experiment is always shadowed by a specter of authoritarianism, even fascism. Here I will explore the work of Herbert Marcuse and Eric Fromm, and finally, I will argue that one of the main threats to real democracy is capitalism, insofar as the goals of capitalism are in direct conflict with the goals of authentic democracy. Section 1, what is democracy? The title of this section might seem a bit silly, since in the Western world, we talk about democracy, talk about democracy fills the air at every turn. The excessive chatter about democracy would suggest that those who engage in this chatter must surely know what democracy is. However, we know that excessive chatter is often used to mask the absence of real substance. We know that the founding fathers in the US, at least, defined democracy as government for the people, by the people. But what does that really mean? What are the necessary conditions for such? This idea suggests that the people must have some degree of freedom and control over their lives. A democratic society is supposed to be structured in such a way that all citizens are able to participate in the decision-making processes by which their lives are affected. In most Western democracies, this participation takes the form of voting, wherein the people elect a political figure to represent their interests and make decisions on their behalf. If this is the case, why are so many people in poverty in democratic societies, especially very wealthy societies like the US? Why are so many people oppressed in some form or another in democratic societies? Why are babies still dying from malnutrition and lack of health care in democratic societies? Why are so many Western democracies engaged in the struggle against authoritarianism and fascism? There are many flaws with the Western democratic experiment that opens the door for fascism. Here, I will focus only on the tendency toward authoritarianism in our Western democratic experiment. My analysis will be guided by the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory and the work of Iris Young. In her book, Inclusion and Democracy, Young examines two models of democracy, the aggregative model and the deliberative model. What is developed in most Western societies is the aggregative model, which is deeply flawed and actually undermines what Marcuse calls direct democracy. Aggregative democracy interprets democracy as a process of aggregating the preferences of citizens in choosing public officials and policies. The goal of democratic decision-making is to decide what leaders, rules, and policies will best correspond to the most widely and strongly held preferences. Young examines four flaws of the aggregative model of democracy. I will briefly mention all four of them, but it is the first one that I will focus on in this paper. The first problem with aggregative democracy I call the problem of preference and opinion formation. Here, people vote on the basis of their opinion with regards to a candidate and the issues that are of concern to that candidate. However, there's no account of the origin of those opinions, nor the conditions under which those opinions were formed. Were they formed through coercion, manipulation, a lack of relevant knowledge, etc.? And I will address this problem in detail a little bit later. The second problem I call the problem of coordination and cooperation. Young writes, a quote from Young, citizens never need to leave the private realm of their own interests and preferences to interact with others whose preferences differ. This model lacks any distinct idea of a public form from interaction of democratic citizens and their motivation to reach some decision. There's no possibility of a political coordination and cooperation. The third problem I call the problem of rationality. Young argues that the aggregative model carries a thin, individualistic form of rationality. Each actor is engaged in instrumental or strategic reasoning about the best way to actualize their preferences, but the aggregative result may have no rationality and has not been arrived at via a process of reasoning. The last problem I call the problem of normative and evaluative objectivity. Here, preferences are viewed as merely subjective with no normative or evaluative objectivity. Political preferences are relative, according to this view. Now, we'll briefly discuss the advantages of deliberative model, and I will avoid going into detail here because I'm most concerned about the first problem with the aggregative model and its connection to authoritarianism. The first ideal of deliberative democracy is inclusion. Young states that a democratic decision is normatively legitimate only if those affected by it are included in the process of discussion and decision making. The second ideal is political equality. That is, participants in an ideal process of deliberative democracy must be equal in the sense that none of them is in a position to coerce or threaten others into accepting certain proposals or outcomes. The third ideal of deliberative democracy is reasonableness. Young writes, reasonable people understand that dissent often produces insight and that decisions and agreements should in principle be open to new challenges. The fourth ideal is publicity. The interaction among participants in a decision-making process form a public in which each person is held accountable to the others. Also, the public is constituted by a variety of individuals, experiences, history, views, ideals, interests, etc. Deliberative democracy requires actions and attitudes that go well beyond voting. Marcuse has reminded us in One Dimensional Man that voting does not abolish the masters or the slaves. Often, voting is nothing more than the choice of one master over another. This is especially true in a capitalist society where the candidates from different parties are still servants of capitalism. This will be addressed in more detail a bit later. Although my focus in this paper will be the problem of preference and opinion formation in democratic processes, I believe that all of the flaws mentioned of the aggregative model of democracy are related to the problem of opinion formation. My argument is that at the level of opinion formation, the individual is plagued by certain social pathologies that are produced by modern capitalist society that creates the conditions for authoritarianism. Now, I will support my argument by exploring some of the insights by Herbert Marcuse and Eric Fromm. So part two, Herbert Marcuse and the erasure of critical consciousness. Again, it is the first sentence of the first chapter of a very important book where we find the most strange claim. Chapter 1 of One Dimensional Man begins as follows. A comfortable, smooth, reasonable, democratic unfreedom prevails in advanced industrial civilization, a token of the technical progress. Indeed, what can be more rational than the suppression of individuality and the mechanization of socially necessary but painful performances, the concentration of individual enterprises in more effective, more productive corporations, the regulation of free competition among unequal economic subjects, the curtailment of the prerogatives and national sovereignties which impede the international organization of resources, end quote. This passage entails the entire spirit of One Dimensional Man. It is an analysis of the social, political, and psychological mechanisms whereby the working class agrees to its own servitude. Western democracies create a facade of freedom while simultaneously subjugating its citizens through various mechanisms of control. The culprit in this unfortunate scheme is capitalism. Insofar as the goal of capitalism is the maximization of profit for the capitalists, all available resources in society, human beings included, are transformed into a means to an end. Hence, the humanity and the human potential of the non-capitalist class must be subdued and directed by the goals of the capitalist class. The non-capitalist class puts up very little, if any, resistance because the system has effectively whittled down its capacity for critical consciousness. Indeed, the system lures its citizens into a false sense of freedom. In an interview with Brian McGee a year before his death, Marcuse reflects on the claim made by Marx that the proletariat has nothing to lose but their chains. Marcuse says today, we know that they have considerably more to lose. What is this more to lose? This theme of one-dimensional man, this is the theme of one-dimensional man. The system delivers enough goods to the non-capitalist class to keep them pacified so that they will not demand full freedom and full democratic participation. One of the mechanisms that is used to seduce the non-capitalist into accepting his oppression is that he identifies with his society. Farr would deal with this problem in terms of identification with the authoritarian leader. Marcuse argues that capitalist societies are structured in such a way that differences, contradictions, and conflict are smoothed over. The oppressed are eager to identify with the oppressor. The rich and the poor seek to present themselves under a false, unified identity. Marcuse writes, the people enter into this stage as preconditioned receptacles of long standing. The decisive difference is in the flattening out of the contrast or conflict between the given and the possible, between the satisfied and the unsatisfied needs. Here, the so-called equalization of class distinctions reveals this ideological function. If the worker and his boss enjoy the same television program and visit the same resort places, if the typist is as attractively made up as the daughter of an employer, if the Negro owns a Cadillac, if they read the same newspaper, then this assimilation indicates not the disappearance of classes, but the extent to which the needs and satisfactions that serve the preservation of the establishment are shared by the underlying population. End quote. In capitalism, what Marcuse calls advanced industrial societies, economic exploitation and extreme wealth inequality is secured against any form of rebellion or resistance due to the protection of false narratives wherein false identities are formed. That is, people have submitted themselves to identity narratives that conceals the various ways by which they are oppressed. The U.S. is called the land of the free, regardless of the multiplicity of forms of unfreedom. The people want to feel like they belong to something important. In the US, people want to feel like they're participating in the American dream. They want to believe that the US is somehow exceptional. They want to believe that if they work hard enough, they will be rewarded. The rich are rich because of some kind of moral commitment. The critique of capitalism hardly exists because everyone has a hope that one day he or she will be rich. In the meantime, various oppressed groups are put against each other. Poor people blame other poor people of different races for their poverty, while at the same time trying to find some common ground between themselves and the rich. This desire of the poor to identify with the rich and powerful has even spilled over into electoral politics where people vote for millionaires and billionaires because they seem like the kind of person you would want to have a beer with. It never occurs to them that these people they vote for would never have a beer with them. The needs and satisfactions of the rich become the needs and satisfactions of the poor. Regarding democracy, the people have developed a form of false consciousness with regards to their own power. The vote is powerless if not properly informed. Further, the Western model of democracy is designed to create a facade of freedom as it advocates political democracy in the absence of economic democracy. And I want to make this point. This is actually a point that Marx makes in his early writings of the 1840s, right? He argues that you cannot have a legitimate political democracy without an economic democracy at the same time. And the idea of economic democracy, that's anathema to our societies, right? So the people are led to believe that their opinions are important while the process of opinion formation is manipulated by the rich and powerful. Marcuse writes, within the established society, we no longer have a majority constituted on the basis of a completely free development of opinion and consciousness. We do not have a majority constituted on the basis of free and equal access to the facts and all the facts. We do not have a majority constituted on the basis of equal education for all. However, we do have a majority which is standardized and manipulated and even constituted by standardized and administered information, communication, and education. In other words, this majority is not free, but it belongs to the very essence of democracy that the people who are sovereign are a free people. End quote. This passage indicates the degree to which there is a common ground between Iris Young and Marcuse. In One Dimensional Man and several other texts as well, Marcuse challenges the idea that mere voting is enough to constitute a democracy. He and Young are on the same page here insofar as they both knew that voting may simply replace one abusive master with another. While we may have changed masters, we have not changed the social, economic, and political structures that produces oppression, exploitation, alienation, and dehumanization. Although the masters may belong to different political parties and may offer slightly different platforms, the masters are of the same class and their interests overlap. In the US, for example, it would be very difficult to find a candidate who is not a capitalist. Even Kamala Harris identified herself as a capitalist. Surely she would have been a much better president than Donald Trump. It goes without saying. However, her policies will still have to protect the capitalist class. At best, she might be able to write and pass policy that would ease the burden of working class people as they struggle to survive. However, she would not support complete social change or the overthrow of the system of capitalism. Any policy that she would pass that might help the poor working people would be nothing but a band-aid that will keep people from revolting. This is precisely what was accomplished by Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal during the Great Depression. It did not end poverty. It simply dropped enough bread on the table of the working class to keep them from revolting. Okay. For Young and Marcuse, democracy requires a form of political engagement that goes beyond voting. Further, the structure of society impacts the process of opinion formation. Although one may freely vote for whomever she chooses, it is the case that the process of opinion formation occurred in the context of the absence of freedom. It seems clear that a system that alienates and exploits its workers will put in place social, economic, political, and psychological mechanisms that would encourage the voter to vote against his or her own self-interest. Are voters properly educated about the important issues of the day? For the most part, no. Part 3, democracy and authoritarianism. In this section, I will examine briefly Marcuse's essay, The Historical Fate of Bourgeois Democracy, which is key for understanding how authoritarianism, totalitarianism, and democracy are linked. In the Communist Manifesto, Marx claims that capitalism has produced its own gravediggers, the proletariat. In a Marcusean spirit, we may say that bourgeois democracy has produced its own gravediggers, authoritarianism, and more precisely, fascism. Reflecting, and this is a bad thing, right? Because what this means is democracy is created in a way it's opposite that will destroy, right? Okay. Reflecting on the election of U.S. President Richard Nixon in 1972, Marcuse writes, the elections of 1972 have demonstrated once again, and clearer than before, the historical fate of bourgeois democracy. Its transformation from a dynamic into a static form of liberal, progressive, into a reactionary, conservative society. This democracy has become the most powerful, listen to this, this democracy has become the most powerful obstacle to change, except to the worse. On the road from laissez-faire to monopoly and state capitalism, the bourgeois democracy in its present form marks the stage where only two alternatives seem possible: neo-fascism on a global scale or a transition to socialism. The former is the more likely one. It would not abolish, but only intensify the established system and give it another breathing spell long enough to cause irremediable destruction, end quote. I would argue that the elections of 2016 and 2024 have been even more devastating for democracy than the election of 1972. However, Marcuse saw the demise of democracy as early as 1972, and even earlier than that. Our present moment is not an anomaly. Our present moment in the US, and I would say globally in a way, and beyond, was present in embryonic form decades ago. In the US, Trump is not the cause of a pathological society, but rather the result and symptom of a pathological society. So I try to tell my friends here they're all focused on getting rid of Trump. That even if Trump goes away, the problem stays. And if we get rid of Trump now, down the road, without any substantial social change, there'll be another Trump, right? Because Trump is produced by a particular kind of system. Nobody's questioning the system. Everybody's attacking Trump. Nobody's questioning the system that produced him. I want to question the system, so we'll never have another one. Marcuse's description of the historical fate of bourgeois democracy sheds light on the oppressive and anti-democratic mechanisms at work in bourgeois society. Our present situation has been in the making for a long time. The miseducation of the working class, the whittling down of critical consciousness, giving the citizens just enough to keep them from revolting, putting different races and minority groups against each other, the repetition of hypnotic phrases about freedom, false narratives about who we are, the lie about American exceptionalism, a theology that promises bliss in the afterlife, the reduction of the concept of sin down to the acts of the individual and not the system, etc. Social contradictions are smoothed over so that enough of the oppressed population can identify with each other and their leaders for the purpose of creating a political base for the rulers. Wealth becomes a moral category that celebrates the rich, while poverty becomes a moral category that condemns the poor. In present-day democracy, one is free to choose his bondage. The liberal focus on the individual as at a metaphysical level ignores the concrete individual who suffers at the hand of so-called democratic rulers. Marcuse writes, bourgeois democracy is giving itself an enlarged popular base which supports the liquidation of the remnants of the liberal period, the removal of government from popular control, and allows the pursuit of imperialist policy, the shibboleth of democracy, government of the people and by the people. Self-government now assumes the form of a large-scale identification of the people with their rulers, caricature of popular sovereignty. He continues, bourgeois democracy retains the capitalist class structure. At the same time, the ruled class, the underlying population at large, becomes the subject object of politics, of democracy. The people, free in the sense and within the limits of capitalism. And in this freedom, reproducing its servitude, end quote. Our conclusion thus far is that capitalism and true democracy are incompatible. The ultimate goal of capitalism and the capitalist is the maximization of profit. This goal does not include the well-being of the workers in a capitalist society. Of course, it is not possible to get people to freely choose their bondage unless there is an ongoing promise that things will get better. This is the promise of every master in the capitalist system. It is a promise that can be kept only if the ultimate goal of capitalism is rejected. The task of the capitalist is to maintain certain social, political, and economic contradictions while presenting the working class with a facade of unity. Marcuse writes, in new ways, because the interplay between production and destruction, liberty and repression, power and submission, that is, the unity of opposites which permeates the entire capitalist society today, has, with the help of technical means not previously available, created among the underlying populations a means not previously available, created among the underlying populations a mental structure which responds to and reflects the requirements of the system. In this mental structure are the deep individual instinctual roots of identification of the conformist majority with the institutionalized brutality and aggression. An instinctual, nay, libidinal affinity binds beneath all rational justification the subjects to the rulers. He continues, the self-rule of the bourgeoisie is complete. in the lineup of the population behind this rule. The working class still occupies a class position of its own against the bourgeoisie, but as a class in this society, not transcending it, not this definite negation. And the class struggle does not interfere with the brutal imperialist policy. International working class solidarity is at a historical low, rather point zero, and the militant anti-war movement is still concentrated in the marginal minoritarian groups, end quote. It is significant in this section of this essay. Marcuse does cite Erich Fromm quite a bit, and he mentions Erich Fromm's book, Escape from Freedom, that I'm going to be talking about uh, in just a moment. So he recognizes the overlap between he and Fromm on some of these points with the analysis of authoritarianism, and particularly the analysis of the way in which the underlying population identifies with their rulers. So now we turn to character analysis and the authoritarian personality. For both Fromm and Marcuse, Western capitalist societies are structured in such a way that its members become willing to forfeit their freedom. However, they both give different but compatible accounts of our escape from freedom. Marcuse offers us an analysis of the structure of advanced industrial society, wherein the ability to think critically or to challenge the system is whittled down. The system provides enough goods to pacify and subdue its citizens. Fromm, on the other hand, provides a more historical account of the development of freedom and the burden that comes with it. The burden of freedom becomes unbearable as a result, produces certain social pathologies. Before a direct examination of Fromm's account of authoritarianism, a passage by Rolf Wigerhaus on Fromm's understanding of authoritarianism might be a bit helpful. So this is Wigerhaus. Authoritarian forms of society, so termed by Fromm, with reference to the widespread discussion which had been going on since the late 1920s about authoritarianism and the total state, were characterized by the way in which every member of society was incorporated into a system of dependency relations with those above and below. For Fromm, this represented a precondition for the existence of functional interplay between the sadomasochistic character and the authoritarian form of society. We have attempted to show, he stated in conclusion, that the authoritarian structure of society both creates and satisfies needs which develop on the basis of sadomasochism. The expressions sadomasochistic and authoritarian thus become synonymous for him, end quote. There are two features of this view of authoritarianism that Fromm and Marcuse share. First, members of society are incorporated into a system of dependency. And second, the system creates and satisfies their needs to some degree. This will be explained in more detail later. For now, I want to briefly outline Fromm's argument regarding the escape from freedom and its transformation into the authoritarian personality. Fromm points out that the modern idea of the free individual is relatively new in human history. The Western understanding of the human person was radically transformed as we exited feudal society and entered the modern era. The change in our concept of the individual parallels certain kinds of changes and developments in economic life. Hence, the free individual parallels the rise of capitalism. Indeed, an individual's mode of life is shaped by the peculiarity of the economic system in which individuals live. Hence, the economic system is a primary factor in shaping the entire character structure of the individual. The imperative need for self-preservation forces him to accept the conditions under which he has to live. It is not possible in the scope of this paper to deal with the details of Fromm's historical account of the desire to escape from freedom. It is more important that we focus on the development of the authoritarian character. However, a bit of historical context should be provided. Fromm argues that during feudalism, every individual had his or her place in society. People were connected to each other through primary bonds. That is, People were connected by their lot in life. The nobleman was a nobleman, and the peasant was a peasant. People lived out their lives in the class to which they were born. However, this situation was not one that allowed optimal human development. Fromm writes, the primary ties block his full human development. They stand in the way of the development of his reason and his critical capacities. They let him recognize himself and others only through the medium of his or their participation in a clan, a social, or religious community, and not as human beings. In other words, they block his development as a free, self-determining, productive individual. But although this is one aspect, there's another. This identity with nature, clan, religion gives the individual security. He belongs to, he is rooted in, a structuralized whole which he has an unquestionable place. He may suffer from hunger or suppression, but he does not suffer from the worst of all pains, complete aloneness and doubt. End quote. Fromm observes that this process of growing human freedom is similar to a process of individual growth as the individual goes through the process of separation individuation. The oneness or unity with the mother and the security of the mother's body is lost at birth. The separation continues as the individual becomes more and more aware of his separateness from others. Both the growth of freedom in the maturation process of the child and the growth of freedom in the human being in society follow a similar path. This from again. On the one hand, it is a process of growing strength and integration, mastery of nature, growing power of human reason, and growing solidarity with other human beings. But on the other hand, this growing individuation means growing isolation, insecurity, and thereby growing doubt concerning one's own role in the universe, the meaning of one's life, and with all that, a growing feeling of one's own powerlessness and insignificance as an individual. End quote. There's a theme here that is also found in existentialism. That is, there's no freedom without anxiety. One's freedom in the face of one's life as his own project for which he is responsible produces anxiety. However, the existentialist attributes this anxiety to human beings in general, in a general sense, while Fromm sees it in what I call the burden of freedom as a particular historical development. Marcuse's approach is similar in his departure from Heidegger's abstract concept of Dasein. Both Fromm and Marcuse are consistent Marxists in their quest to discover the way in which human consciousness is not fully determined by, but at least shaped by, material conditions and material circumstances. In Fromm's case, the change in material conditions produces a new ideology, which in return leads to the development of a certain type of social character. The economic changes, as well as the advent of modern science, developments in technology, and a plethora of scientific discoveries during the late medieval period, led to a new worldview that greatly impacted humanity's self-understanding. The drive to be independent of all social, economic, and religious shackles took center stage in the drama of human life. It is in this context that the idea of the free individual is born. Even nature was to be viewed as something that must be subdued by free, rational individuals. However, this new freedom came with a price. Fromm writes, to the degree to which the individual, figuratively speaking, has not yet completely severed the umbilical cord which fastens him to the outside world, he lacks freedom. But these ties give him security and a feeling of belonging and of being rooted somewhere. I wish to call these ties that exist before the process of individuation has resulted in a complete emergence of the individual primary ties. They are organic in the sense that they are a part of normal human development. They imply a lack of individuality, but they also give security and orientation to the individual. They are the ties that connect the child with his mother, the member of a primitive community with his clan and nature, or the medieval man with the church and his social caste. Once the stage is complete, once the stage of complete individuation is reached and the individual is free from these primary ties, he's confronted with a new task to orient and root himself in the world and find security in other ways than those which were characteristic of the pre-individualistic existence. End quote. Freedom from primary ties leaves the individual alone with the daunting task of carving out his own identity and place in the world. Regardless of one's social and economic situation, each individual is expected to pull himself or herself up by his bootstraps. Freedom becomes a heavy burden as the individual is responsible for giving purpose and direction to his own life. Or, in the words of Sartre, one must take up one's own life as his own unique project. Or, as Heidegger puts it, one who was thrown into existence at birth now becomes the thrower. The security that we once found in the context of primary ties have been forfeited for freedom. However, the impulse to seek security never goes away. Fromm writes, impulses arise to give up one's individuality, to overcome the feeling of aloneness and powerlessness by completely submerging oneself in the world outside. These impulses, however, and the new ties arising from them are not identical with the primary ties which have been cut off in the process of growth itself. He continues, however, submission is not the only way of avoiding aloneness and anxiety. The other way, the only one which is productive and does not end in insoluble conflict, is that of spontaneous relationship of man to nature, a relationship that connects the individual with the world without eliminating his individuality. End quote. Submission to the world outside is one way of responding to the problem of aloneness and anxiety. The other is a spontaneous relationship with man and nature. Here I will focus on the first because it is that response that leads to the development of the authoritarian character. The second possible response will be developed in more detail by Fromm in later texts. However, the first possible solution is the one that has been developed in modern society and has closed off possibilities of the development of the second possibility. The entire project of critical theory is to understand and explain why our societies do not develop the more positive possibility, but produce the authoritarian personality instead. The first possible solution will lead to solidarity with other human beings, love and work which will unite us with the world again. However, this new unity with the world will be one that allows for security and individuality at the same time. Nonetheless, Fromm observes, however, if the economic, social, and political conditions on which the whole process of human individuation depends do not offer a basis for the realization of individuality in the sense just mentioned, while at the same time people have lost these ties which gave them security, this lag makes freedom an unbearable burden. It then becomes identical with doubt, with the kind of life which lacks meaning and direction. Powerful tendencies arise to escape from this kind of freedom into submission or some kind of relationship to man in the world, which promises relief from uncertainty, even if it deprives the individual of his freedom. The society that produces the individual by cutting the primary ties to which the individual once belonged is the same society that produces the need to escape from freedom, and it produces the social, political, and economic mechanisms that prevent the healthy development of the individual in solidarity with other human beings and nature. Fromm focuses in Escape from Freedom, his focus in Escape from Freedom is the development of the authoritarian character as a response to the above mentioned problem. However, we must take a brief detour through his book, The Sane Society, since it is in that book where he develops a more detailed critique of the mechanisms that prevent the development of a healthy and productive response to the problem of freedom and anxiety. Capitalism and the global mental health crisis. We live in a time when the concept of sanity, mental health, etc., must be re-examined through the lenses of critical theory. It is commonplace in Western societies to interpret mental health as the proper adjustment of the individual to his or her society. It is assumed that the society itself is healthy and functions properly, while certain individuals fail to properly adjust to the well-adjusted, healthy, sane society. Fromm opens the sane society with the following statement. Nothing is more common than the idea that we, the people living in the Western world of the 20th century, are eminently sane. Even the fact that a great number of individuals in our midst suffer from more or less severe forms of mental illness produces little doubt with respect to the general standard of our mental health. We are sure that by introducing better methods of mental hygiene, we shall improve still further the state of our mental health. And as far as individual mental disturbances are concerned, we look at them as strictly individual incidents, perhaps with some amazement that so many of these individuals should occur in a culture which is supposedly sane. End quote. As we see in our examination of Escape from Freedom, the transition from feudalism to the modern era created a view of the individual as self-contained, a free individual who stood alone as one who was supposed to give purpose and shape to his or her own life. The individual was cut off from his or her primary bonds and must assert his new freedom in giving shape to his life. Therefore, any pathology that develops in the individual belongs strictly to the individual. Since the individual is free, he must have the inner resources to adapt to society, take up his life, and give it direction. To the extent that the individual is unable to direct his life in such a way that it is a step within society as a whole, the individual has a pathology or a mental illness that must be treated. The mental activity of the individual must be changed so that the individual conforms to the values and practices of the society, which itself does not have to change. Hence, society is divided up between the sane and the insane, the well-adjusted and the maladjusted. Now, I'm aware that there are many sources of mental illness. I'm also aware that there are those who suffer from forms of chemical imbalances which impact their behavior. I'm also aware of the role that immediate environment plays in the mental health of the individual. However, it is not the case that all mental disturbances are strictly a function of the failure of the mental apparatus of the individual. To argue for such would be to treat mental illness in the most superficial manner. In a society where mental illness is a growing problem, it is legitimate to critically examine the society in which the individual was produced. In the event that anyone finds a suggestion that we have the audacity to question the sanity of Western society, Fromm reminds us of the incredible amount of wealth that has been accumulated in Western society over the last century. At the same time, think of the millions of human beings who lost their lives in an arrangement called war. I would bracket any further discussion of war here because it would take us too far away from other key points that I want to make. However, for later conversation, we should think about the modern technology and evolution of a perpetual readiness for war. We would have to think about the amount of our national budget dedicated to saving life as opposed to amounts dedicated to ending life. I must say one thing here about the insanity of the war and war preparation. The military budget in Western societies are producers of death in a twofold sense. First, these budgets are used to develop technologies of death and destruction. Secondly, while money is spent on technologies and mechanisms of death and destruction, a subtle and quiet death occurs daily in these countries with enormous military budgets. Millions of people in these countries die each year from starvation, malnutrition, lack of medical care, and so on. We build war machines to protect the very people whom we allow to die from starvation and lack of medical care. Both forms of death caused by excessive military spending are accepted by the general public without protest, a general public that calls itself sane. We may simply mention here another form of impending death that is the result of an unhindered capitalist exploitation, and that is the death of the environment, which also means the death of humanity. To be well adjusted in Western society is to be well adjusted to these and other forms of death and destruction. Hence, while the problem of mental health has particular manifestations in particular individuals, the problem of mental health is really a problem of the whole of Western society. Fromm observes, yet many psychiatrists and psychologists refuse to entertain the idea that society as a whole might be lacking sanity. They hold that the problem of mental health in a society is only that of the number of unadjusted individuals and not that of a possible unadjustment of culture itself, end quote. Fromm's work will focus on the adjustment of culture itself. The issue at hand is not individual pathology, but rather the pathology of normalcy. That is, conformity to the norm of a repressive and oppressive society is itself a pathology. To be well adjusted is to perhaps be the most sick. I will address this problem in the next section under automation. Here, I want to briefly explore Fromm's critique of capitalism with regards to sanity and the illusion of freedom. The same society contains a very long chapter entitled Man in Capitalist Society, where Fromm discusses the facade of freedom in capitalist society. There he argues that the freedom of the individual is largely an illusion. In a capitalist society, the individual's freedom is not directed toward activities that fulfill the individual, and it does not lead to the creation of activities that allows the individual to develop his unique human qualities. Instead, freedom is converted to the slavery of production. However, there is the illusion of freedom insofar as the individual freely sells his labor power, but not at a price that he chooses. The individual appears to be free as he chooses products provided by the market. In the same society, Fromm discusses the development of capitalism from 17th to 20th centuries. How am I on time? Am I okay on time?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, we still have
Okay,
time.
good.
Yeah.
Okay. So here's a quote from Fromm. The living human being, with his desires and woes, loses more and more his central place in the system, and this place is occupied by business and production. Man ceases to be the measure of all things in the economic sphere. The most characteristic element of 19th century capitalism was, first of all, ruthless exploitation of the worker. It was believed to be a natural or social law that hundreds of thousands of workers were living at the point of starvation. The owner of capital was supposed to be morally right if in the pursuit of profit he exploited the maximum he exploited the maximum I'm sorry, he exploited to the maximum the labor he hired. There was hardly any sense of human solidarity between the owner of capital and his workers, end quote. We know now that things are no better, perhaps even worse, under monopoly capitalism. The so-called freedom of the individual has been enslaved to the so-called freedom of the market. However, the need for the worker to sell his labor power and to function as a worker and consumer requires the illusion of freedom. It is in this context that the free individual becomes alienated from everything that might affirm his humanity. The individual is free, yet not in control, and is at the mercy of a system which is larger and more powerful than he. Naturally, the individual begins to feel powerless and useless. Ultimately, this feeling of aloneness and powerlessness begins to shape the character development of the individual. This brings us back to Escape from Freedom. For several chapters, Fromm traces the development of the new concept of the free individual and the developing need to escape from freedom from the late medieval period up to the 20th century. The details are far too many to address here, but one of the key critiques is of the Reformation and the free individual who no longer needed someone to intercede before God on behalf of the individual. However, the priesthood of the believer established freedom that was necessary to then freely submit to religious authority. This submission is preceded by a feeling of powerlessness and worthlessness before the Almighty God. Hence, the new freedom, a feeling of powerlessness, I'm sorry. Hence, the new freedom becomes the freedom to enslave oneself to an external authority, an authority that is not visible and can't be challenged by the weak and powerless human individual. This form of thinking becomes a perfect tool for the submission to the infinite power of the invisible market. Here's a quote from Farr. We neglect the role of the anonymous authorities like public opinion and common sense, which are so powerful because of our profound readiness to conform to expectations everybody has about ourselves and our equally profound fear of being different. In other words, we are fascinated by the growth of freedom and from powers outside of ourselves and are blinded to the fear of inner restraints, compulsions, and fears, which tend to undermine the meaning of victories freedom has won against traditional enemies, end quote. The modern concept of the free individual creates a situation where the individual is free only as he acts under no external influence. This view of freedom finds its most developed, sophisticated expression in the Kantian philosophy. However, such a view contradicts the human need for solidarity, the need to not stand alone as one carries out one's life. We might say that the modern idea of the free individual dismisses the need to belong to something outside of oneself or the need for connection to another. The human being does not desire to stand on the ledge hanging over an abyss by himself. Hence, the fear of being different is the fear of being disconnected to the world in which we live. Therefore, we have a tendency to seek connection to forces outside of us while ignoring our own inner impulses. Hence, it appears that one would rather be a slave and march to one's orders from an external source than to accept the responsibility of taking up one's project as one's very own. The Protestant Reformation made the individual face of God alone as a powerless, the Protestant Reformation made the individual face God alone as a powerless subject standing before an absolute power. Although the Catholic Church remained intact during the Protestant Reformation, this new image of the individual still permeated all of Western society. Outside of the church or religion, this view of the individual was useful for capitalism. Fromm writes, psychologically, this spiritual individualism is not too different from the economic individualism. In both instances, the individual is completely alone and in isolation faces superior power, be it God, of competitors, or impersonal economic forces. The individualistic relationship to God was the psychological preparation for the individualistic character of man's secular activities, end quote. Under capitalism, economic success and material gains became ends in themselves, while the individual becomes a means to an end. The acquisition of more and more capital by the few becomes the central motivation for human activity. The security and happiness of the individual is of no concern. Hence, the so-called free individual is simply free to serve the system and must accept a life that goes unfulfilled. Fromm argues that the theologies of John Calvin and Martin Luther contributed to the removal of human fulfillment from the center of human activity. This is in direct opposition to the medieval belief that human activity should be for the sake of human development and fulfillment. Further, the God of Luther and Calvin was not a loving or caring God, nor a God of justice. Both theologians focus on the power of God and not his love. And quoting from here, once man was ready to become nothing but the means for the glory of God, who represented neither justice nor love, he was sufficiently prepared to accept the role of a servant to the economic machine and eventually the Führer. The subordination of the individual as a means to economic ends is based on the peculiarities of the capitalist mode of production, which makes the accumulation of capital the purpose and aim of economic activity. One works for profit's sake, but the profit one makes is not made to be spent, but to be invested as new capital. This increased capital brings new profits, which again are invested, and so on in a circle. End quote. The individual becomes dependent on the laws of the market and is thereby subject to an external force. In his 1844 manuscripts, Marx discusses four forms of alienation that develop under capitalism. Fromm does not discuss alienation directly in Escape from Freedom. However, as a careful reader of Marx, the concept of alienation is ever present in Fromm's work. According to Marx, the worker is alienated from the product of his labor. I'm going to actually skip over this part because I think most of us are familiar with those forms of alienation discussed by Marx in the 1844 manuscripts. So I'll skip that. I think I would pick up here. Yeah, so the modern individual is free only to the extent that he or she is no longer bound by primary ties. This creates a lack of solidarity with others and a lack of security, as well as a sense of powerlessness. This escape from freedom is an attempt to reconnect with something outside of oneself for the sake of security, solidarity, and empowerment. It is this escape from freedom that leads to authoritarianism. It is through a connection with a powerful individual or group that the individual feels secure and powerful again. The striving for security leads to a striving for submission. Fromm elaborates on two different but related forms of striving, the sadistic and the masochistic. The masochistic form of striving is rooted in the need to overcome one's feeling of inferiority and powerlessness. Here, the individual gives up his independence for the sake of connecting with a more powerful individual or group. There is a fusion of the individual and the powerful other. The individual loses himself in the powerful other and becomes submissive. Masochism often includes what appears to be its opposite, sadism. It is worth quoting from at length here. Beside these masochistic trends, the very opposite of them, namely sadistic tendencies, are regularly to be found in the same kind of characters. They vary in strength and more or less conscious, yet they are never missing. We find three kinds of sadistic tendencies more or less closely knit together. One is to make others dependent on oneself and to have absolute unrestricted power over them, so as to make them nothing but instruments, clay in the potter's hands. Another consists in the impulse not only to rule over others in the absolute fashion, but to exploit them, to use them, to steal from them, to disembowel them, and so to speak, to incorporate anything edible in them. End quote. And then he goes on, a third kind of sadistic tendency is to wish to make others suffer or see them suffer. Regarding this third form of sadism, this suffering of others can be physical or mental. The aim is to hurt and humiliate others. All three of these features of sadism should remind one of the behavior of the Nazis toward the Jewish people in the 1930s and the rhetoric by contemporary authoritarian figures like Trump and Bolsonaro and their followers. The authoritarian leaders is in the eyes of the people what Freud called the ego ideal. The people find security, meaning, and purpose by identifying with the powerful figure. As a collective, individuals feel empowered, secure, and that they can now overcome limitations that was placed on them by society. In some ways, the group becomes God or is ordained by God to carry out a special mission. This mission is often the destruction of others who are not a part of their group. The authoritarian character structure represents the loss of the individual's identity while replacing it with another one, the identity of the group or group leader. Hence, the individual no longer has a will and a life of his own, but becomes an automaton. In the next section, section 4, automatization and one-dimensional man, thinking with Fromm and with Marcuse. One of the most interesting forms of escape from freedom is what Fromm calls automaton conformity. Here, I want to briefly explore this concept as used by Fromm and connect it to Marcuse's concept of one-dimensionality. Authoritarianism demands that individuals give up their own individual identity for the sake of the group or the leader to which the group is attached. However, this act is possible because Western society's general structure makes it possible. Automaton conformity is a mechanism that the majority of normal individuals find in society. Fromm writes, to put it briefly, the individual ceases to be himself. He adopts entirely the kind of personality offered to him by cultural patterns, and he therefore becomes exactly as all others are and as they expect him to be. This discrepancy between I and the world disappears with it, the conscious fear of aloneness and powerlessness. End quote. Marcuse's concept of the performance principle and one-dimensionality captures this very same idea. Although Marcuse's One-Dimensional Man is written with a style and approach quite different from Fromm's, given the subject matter, it could be entitled Escape from Freedom insofar as it deals with the free forfeiture of freedom by individuals in advanced industrial societies. Okay, I have again that quote from chapter 1 of One-Dimensional Man. I'm not going to quote that again here. So I'm going to skip some more. Oh, I do want to read this though. The main thesis of One-Dimensional Man is that modern capitalist society is structured in such a way that it makes those who are in need of liberation comply with their own oppression. It does this by whittling down or restricting the possible development of critical consciousness. Critical consciousness is a form of negative thinking that negates the present oppressive order of things by exposing real possibilities for social change and liberation. One-dimensional thinking restricts social reality to the facts while concealing the social factors by which those facts are produced. According to Marcuse, social facts contain within themselves the possibility of being otherwise. One-dimensional society conditions its citizens to believe that things cannot be otherwise, and society in its present form is the best that we can ask for. In an interview with Brian McGee, Marcuse disagreed with the claim made by Marx that the proletariat has nothing to lose but their chains. Marcuse said today they have considerably more. I think I read that earlier, so I think this is a repeat, right? So moving down a little further, I'm about to finish up. I'll skip this. Marcuse claims several times throughout the text, One-Dimensional Man, that in modern society, real contradictions are smoothed over to appear as if they do not exist. We have developed an entire language that conceals contradictions. Identification or the unification of opposites conceal the need for any social change. I've known people who voted for a particular political candidate because they thought that he was the kind of person you would like to have a beer with. They completely ignore the fact that the candidate in question will never have a beer with him. Marcuse's point is well taken. If the worker and the boss, that's a quote again from One-Dimensional Man. I won't repeat that. Okay, so this identification is also assimilation insofar as those at the socioeconomic bottom of society are assimilated into the order of things in that society. They act as they are supposed to act. They desire what they are supposed to desire. The slave identifies with the master. Marcuse uses the term mimesis in reference to the way in which the dominated internalize the values of those who dominate. The individual identifies with his oppressive society and with the oppressor as well. This is why authoritarianism is often intertwined with nationalism. The very structure of an advanced industrial society impacts the use of language. Language develops in a way that is designed to prohibit the development of critical consciousness. Marcuse claims that even our language has closed off, has a closed off analytical structure. He writes, on either side, transgression of the discourse beyond the closed analytical structure is incorrect or propaganda. Although the means of enforcing the truth and the degree of punishment are very different, in this universe of public discourse, speech moves in synonyms and tautologies. Actually, it never moves toward qualitative difference. the analytic structure insulates the governing noun from those of its contents, which would invalidate or at least disturb the accepted use of the noun in statements of policy or public opinion. The ritualized concept is made immune against contradiction. End quote. Marcuse's point here is that even language is designed to protect the establishment. It conceals possibilities. Ritualized concepts or hypnotic phrases such as freedom, democracy, free world, the market, equality, free enterprise, etc., belong to a discourse that maintains the status quo instead of providing the basis of critique of the present system. These ritualized concepts function to create a facade of unity in the midst of disunity and oppression. They have a hypnotizing effect that leads to the surrender of the individual to the present order of things. Um, I have one more last little section entitled Authoritarianism and the Global Mental Health Crisis, the Sane Society. I'm going to skip it because I want to have time for your questions and comments. But in this little section, I further unpack some of the stuff going on in the Sane Society, and I do a brief kind of lit review of some of the recent literature on authoritarianism and on fascism, especially some of the literature by media figures in the US. And the problem with that literature is none of it involves a deep critique of the structures of our society that produces authoritarianism, right? They all sort of address individuals who become fascist individuals, right? And so, for example, there's a tons of books here, even by Trump's niece, about Trump and his personality, right? But not the social structures that produced him, right? And so again, you have a whole body of literature being developed now as a response to this present moment, but it's all about the individual and not the social structures that produce the individual. So they really don't help us at all. So with that, I stop. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Professor, for sharing with us your critical thought. It has been a very meaningful experience for us. So now we invite our friends, our colleagues to share your questions or comment. Les invitamos, claro, también después de agradecer también en español al profesor Farr por su contribución, por compartir con nosotros su perspectiva crítica y la apropiación de Herbert Marcuse. Les invitamos a plantear preguntas, comentarios, ya sea en el chat, a levantar la mano. Por aquí hay una mano levantada. También si alguien nos escucha por allá en nuestras redes sociales, en YouTube o en Facebook, pueden plantear preguntas. Como ustedes prefieran, si quieren, puede ser la pregunta directamente en español y la traducimos, o pueden plantearla en inglés directamente, como ustedes prefieran. Ya tenemos algo, me parece, por acá.
Sí,
Eh,
Leandro pregunta algo, está en
sí,
inglés y también Ramón ha levantado la mano y creo que seguiría yo y a ver qué
sí.
tanto tiempo nos da para que Far nos comente.
Sí, claro. Si les parece, leo la pregunta de Leandro. Dice, Dear Arnold, thank you for your lecture. Currently, authoritarianism seems to be making a comeback not only in the United States and the global north, but also in other parts of the world where the exploitation of the working classes is extreme. Based on Marcuse and his diagnosis of closed societies, what possibilities exist for confronting this authoritarian logic amidst a landscape of growing difficulties? Leandro, no, Leandro pregunta que considerando este posible regreso, bueno, le quitamos lo posible, el regreso del autoritarismo en Estados Unidos y en el norte global, eh, pregunta si basado en el diagnóstico de Marcuse y su concepto de sociedades cerradas, ¿qué posibilidades existen de confrontar este autoritarismo? So we have here our first question for you, Professor Farr.
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's a difficult question, but I'll take a stab at it. So a couple of things come to mind here. First of all, I believe in international solidarity. I believe in working across national borders. That's first and foremost for me. But in recognizing that, I also understand that things are happening in different ways in different countries, right? Um, what's happening in Mexico might be slightly different or unique in some ways, right? What's happening in Brazil might be different in some ways. Nevertheless, fascism is fascism, and it is becoming a kind of global problem. And so there's a need for international solidarity, but at the same time, a recognition as we engage each other from different nations, how it might be working differently in one country than another, right? But I still think we have a lot to learn from each other in terms of how fascism and authoritarianism works. And one of the things a couple of things I'm seeing um, in terms of a hope for resistance is, and I think this is the nature of capitalism too. I've been reading some of the Hungarian Marxists on this, uh, and they too, some of them, it's Esteban Mazuros, I think if I pronounce his name correctly, actually believes that capitalism had a period of ascension, right, where it grew and developed and moved forward, and then it will also have a period of descension where it's kind of like Marx predicting the collapse of capitalism. And his reasoning is that it can only go so far until it destroys everything, right? And at some point, there will have to be a reckoning as the capitalist class gets bolder and bolder. That's precisely what I see them doing. They are really jacked up, right? And they're getting bolder and bolder and more aggressive, right? And I think their activities will no longer remain hidden. And my hope is that at some point people will become more conscious or develop that critical consciousness that has been whittled down that Marcuse talks about, right? Because they can't help themselves, they can't stop, and they're gonna, my hope, go too far, and it's gonna backfire on them, right? I'm seeing possibilities of that maybe in the U.S. now. Um, uh, and that's my hope. Um, uh, Capitalism is not gonna stop asserting itself and becoming bolder and bolder in that assertion. And I think one day people will see it and understand it and say this has to stop. That's my hope. I hope we can do that in an international way.
Thank you very much, Professor Farr. I'm going to make a very brief Spanish translation. Traduciré rápidamente algo que nos comenta el profesor acerca de lo que comentó. Decía que él cree en la solidaridad internacional. Sin embargo, reconoce pues que hay problemas particulares en cada uno de los países y localidades, ¿no? Lo cual hace complejo el problema. Sin embargo, como un vistazo de esperanza al final de su comentario, nos decía que espera que, dado que, como observamos que está sucediendo, de hecho, en Estados Unidos, que el comportamiento de la clase dominante y de la clase capitalista se hace cada vez más atrevida, cada vez más, pues digamos, diría yo, esta es palabra mía, un tanto más cínica, más descarada, pues que espera que la gente cada vez vaya cobrando conciencia sobre el comportamiento y lo que está sucediendo en general, ¿no? Bueno, en general, ese es un breve resumen, aunque muy breves por cuestión de tiempo, ¿no? Vamos ahora, en el orden en el que levantaron la mano, teníamos a Ramón. Adelante, Ramón, bienvenido.
Buenas noches, maestro. Pues no sé si quiere, pregunto en español, bueno, no, en inglés, y luego si quiere traduzco para que entienda la gente y ya. Este, ah, um, I take some notes during the conference, and I had some ideas. It is a problem that society needs to be in submission so society can survive. If is submission not possible, we cannot be a society. For the political order, the mental apparatus is so controlled, so they act in the world, and today is a difficult condition. We cannot do things if we have not a, a, a good mental condition. So we depend about the medicine. I don't know. Uh, I want to know if the submission is just a temporary problem or is like absolute. And we can say then that humanity is sick. So how can we name that condition? Because in object is capitalism, but
Mm,
as a subjective form, I think is vulnerability. Now, I like so much the distinction between Marcuse and Fromm, but I don't know if we think freedom since Hannah Arendt, we can like make a distinction between a negative condition of the politic reality and the social reality. And the politic way of think comes from fear. So
mm,
that's uh, uh, a little bit of what I think, and also the anxiety that freedom responsibility represents is totally Hegelian. I think that if the phenomenon suspends itself, then is not with that responsibility. So the body have not sense, and when the body have not consciousness over the condition, then thinks it free. But it's a false condition of freedom. Social life and life itself remembers uh, to the subject that reality is concrete, and we need security because maybe our essence is vulnerability. Uh, that's it.
mm. Two things. I think in some ways, as finite creatures, I think our essence is to some extent, yes, vulnerability. Um, uh, but I don't think vulnerability has to necessarily lead us into submission, right? I think there are ways of avoiding that. And you mentioned something earlier. Yes, you asked if submission is absolute. Um, And in a pessimistic moment, sometimes you look around and it's almost you want to say, "Oh yeah," but I don't want to say that. I don't want to say this absolute. I would say it's contingent, right? Which means is you really can't say whether it's absolute or not. It's contingent, and one never knows how certain political, social, economic factors are going to play out, right? And this is one of the things I liked about Marcuse is Marcuse was so sensitive to the moment, right? That I mean, I remember debating with some people many years ago who really hadn't read Marcuse that carefully, and they'll talk about him as having mood swings or either being pessimistic or optimistic, and that's not the case. Marcuse, as a dialectical thinker, he recognized those moments uh, in the present where here is something happening that is the potential for liberation, right? But at the same time, as that's happening, here's something else developing over here that has the potential for further repression and oppression. And one has to be able to really understand this kind of ongoing tug of war between forces of oppression and forces of liberation, and how to move people toward one as opposed to the other. I think so. I don't think the submission is absolute, and I do think also um, I think there may be a point. For example, um, and this is I'm not sure how I was working in other countries, but I do know in the U.S. Um, I can easily see how poor working class white people were duped into voting for Trump. And not even just white people, even some poor Hispanics and some poor black people were duped into voting for Trump, right? Um, but at the same time, some of those people are now having regrets because Trump is doing what he intended to do in the first place, right? And not for a single moment did he care about working class people, right? That's not on his agenda. He had to put it there to get elected, right? And people voted out for him out of frustration because the Democratic Party had failed on their promises because they're a capitalist party too, right? And they can't promise but so much and do so much because they are capitalism too, right? And so people were frustrated, and American voters vote on the basis of mood swings, right? And it's who has the most believable promise at the moment, or who they're pissed at the moment, right? And so I can see how Trump got elected, but now that he's not delivering at all, right? And they're saying, man, I thought when he got in office, I was going to be able to afford my groceries, but things are getting worse. um, that might lead to a possible moment of critical reflection. All right, and that I think we can hope for maybe in other countries also that that these guys aren't gonna fulfill their promises and they aren't gonna make decisions that are good for the average everyday working person. And at some point, people are going to get frustrated and say, never again, right? But what has to happen in that moment? What has to happen in that moment is we on the left got to talk to them. One of the most frustrating things in the U.S. for my liberal and progressive friends here is I think they're possessed by a form of self-righteousness, right? And what I mean by that, how many of my friends on the left, when we start talking about having conversations with Trump people or having conversations with those who are on the opposite side politically, they'll say, "Oh, you can't talk to those people." And they take on this spirit of righteous indignation. I will not talk to them. I'm so righteous. I will not talk to them. Okay, don't. See what happens, right? And I think the left, we're a problem. We're a problem because of that type of self-righteousness, right? And I see it. I'm not sure about other places, but it's bad here in the U.S. My left friends, you can't talk to those people. I will not talk to them, And I have one friend that's horrible about it. And I tell them, you guys take that position because you're lazy, right? You don't want to do anything. You want to be theoretically correct without doing any hard work. And so I think there are moments when those people who are submissive in the way that you've mentioned will become frustrated. But it's our job on the left to know when that moment is and to know how to have a conversation and how to listen to them. I'll give you an example. Let me pause because you got to translate, Caesar, right? Should I stop for a minute, then pick up?
Yeah, I'll make a short translation
Okay.
after your
I get excited.
comments.
I'm sorry.
No, don't worry, don't worry. Go on. Okay, so you finished. Okay.
I have one more thing to say, but I want you to translate first so
Ok, ok.
you won't
Yeah.
forget.
Es-
Sí, primero la pregunta de Ramón era sobre si la sumisión, la sujeción es un dato absoluto, es digamos si es inherente a la condición humana o si más bien es producto de los factores históricos, ¿no? El profesor Farr decía, y creo que muy acorde con una perspectiva de un materialismo histórico, que depende más de las condiciones históricas y que actualmente ve algo de esperanza, porque bueno, él comentaba un poco este fenómeno muy particular de que, hablando en el caso específico de Estados Unidos, aunque es algo que también observamos en otros países en el que ciertas plataformas totalitarias o neofascistas incluso han obtenido grandes cantidades de votos, este fenómeno de que las comunidades de bajos recursos, la gente pobre, ha votado por ellos, ¿no? Comentaba un poco este caso de que muchas personas pobres en Estados Unidos votaron por Trump y que actualmente muestran un poquito pues incluso de arrepentimiento, ¿no? Porque comentaba que en un primer momento, en su primera gestión, Trump hizo muchas promesas a la clase trabajadora, a la gente pobre, pero promesas que evidentemente no se han cumplido y por eso actualmente mucha gente está decepcionada. Y comentaba el profesor que la labor de los teóricos de izquierda, quienes nos situamos o nos autodeclaramos en un pensamiento de izquierda, es esperar ese momento, saber diagnosticar el momento en el que las plataformas autoritarias no cumplen sus promesas y cuando esa decepción en la gente puede suscitar un pensamiento crítico, ¿no? Y es justo ahí cuando hay que dialogar con las personas. Bueno, eso es un breve resumen, tratando de retomar lo más esencial para que tengamos tiempo de seguir dialogando. So, Professor, you can go on, please.
So I want to tell you about a couple of experiences I've had in terms of in terms of producing what I call democratic discourse with those on the right, right? So there are two experiences. One, I got involved with a group called Surge, SURJ, that's showing up for racial justice. And Surge is a group of white people who are anti-racist people, right? And they try to go out and go canvassing from door to door to talk to white people about racism. And I got involved in one of the groups and I went out with a friend of mine. We went to a working class white neighborhood and just knocked on doors and talked to people about their problems, what concerned them, what were their political concerns, social concerns, and people just talked, right? And I remember on one occasion, we did raise questions about race too. And on one occasion, a guy who's middle aged, must be about 50 or so, working in his yard, he stopped to talk to us. And all of a sudden, a tear was coming from his eye and he began to cry. And he was crying because he remembered the point in his life when he became a racist. He had a black friend he used to play with. And when he turned 7 or 8, his father said to him, "You can't play with that kid anymore." Right. And so he was being made a racist at that moment. And that bothered him. And he cried and he talked about it. Another occasion, so that tells me I can talk to those people. Another occasion is I ran for office a few years ago. I ran for city council. And I got votes from Trump people. Not many, but just a handful. And one of the couples, an elderly couple, owned a bar in town. And not only did they vote for me, they put my sign up in the bar and they allowed me to do a fundraiser. So I play guitar and sing. And I put on a show and it was a fundraiser for my campaign. And these were Trump people. There's another group of Trump people here in town. They're musicians. It's a bunch of old guys who used to play in bands years ago and they get together once every 2 months at a bar and they play. And they invited me to play. So I've been going every couple of months playing with those guys. And when I was running for office, um, they all asked for yard signs to put in their yard because I had yard signs in my car, right? They were Trump people. But I don't beat them over the head. I deal with them as humans first. We just let's play music. Let's have some beer, right? We play music. We talk about music, and then when the floor opens for other things, we talk about other things, but they're able to talk and be friendly toward me and support my campaign because they were dealt with as human. And I think we on the left have to learn to do that. Don't see them as, oh, this person's a racist, this person's a Trump supporter, this person's a whatever. First of all, the person's human. And when you deal with them as human, you'll get more results than when you deal with them as some label. So I just want to share those two experiences. That's why I'm convinced that if we decide to do so, we can actually talk to some of those people and help them develop critical consciousness. They're not a lost cause in my mind.
Bien, rápidamente en su intervención anterior, el profesor Farr comentaba que como pensadores críticos de izquierda no había que caer en esta postura en la que muchos caen a veces de que, no sé, las personas de derechas, los fascistas, no se puede hablar con ellos. No, al contrario, hay que buscar los puntos, encuentros de diálogo y mencionaba dos casos, dos experiencias personales, una de ellas con un grupo, un movimiento de gente blanca que iba de puerta en puerta buscando hablar y concientizar también a la gente blanca sobre el racismo, ¿no? Y comentaba que en alguna ocasión se unió con ellos y que les platicó una persona de aproximadamente 50 años que incluso te lloró un poco contándole la anécdota de que tenía un amigo siendo niño, muy, muy pequeño, como a los 6 años, si no mal recuerdo, un amigo negro con quien pues se llevaba muy bien, pero que su padre en algún momento le dijo que ya no podía jugar con él, ¿no? Y mencionaba el otro caso de que en algún momento el propio profesor se postuló para un cargo público y que tuvo la oportunidad de conocer durante la campaña a votantes de Trump, gente que votaba por Trump y se autodeclaraba gente de Trump, pero con quienes compartió, tocaron música, bebieron cerveza, platicaron de cosas, pues digamos, cotidianas y pues encontraban puntos en común de conversación, ¿no? Y un poco la idea, cerrando el comentario, decía el profesor Farr, de que pues si entramos en diálogo con los otros, con quienes son o con quienes consideramos que apoyan el fascismo, las derechas, no como persona, no, perdón, no como etiquetas, no considerándolos como etiquetas, sino como seres humanos, a partir de sus experiencias humanas, pues se puede abrir una posibilidad de diálogo mucho más interesante y pues a partir de ahí eh, y buscar suscitar eventualmente un pensamiento más consciente y crítico, ¿no? Bien, thank you very much for your answer, professor. So now, Bere, tú tenías la mano levantada, ¿verdad? Si quieren, vamos con lo tuyo. Tenemos tiempo todavía de lo tuyo. Por acá en el chat también hay eh, un par de comentarios. No, uno, el de Marcelo, así que vamos bien. Adelante, Bere.
Eh, yo me voy a animar a hacerlo en español para que nos apoyes con la traducción y bueno, quisiera comentar y creo que es a partir de también la última invitación que nos hace el profesor Farr a dialogar, es preguntarle que si en este contexto él podría ver cierta relación en el desarrollo o en el desenvolvimiento de esta tolerancia represiva que alguna vez nos habló Marcuse, con este individualismo radical que nos ha descrito y que en ciertos contextos como los que él nos relata en sus experiencias, eh, esta tolerancia represiva puede relacionarse con la emergencia de relaciones sociales donde se presente el autoritarismo.
Mhm. Okay, so the question is accepting your invitation to the dialogue. The question that puts Barry is that considering uh, es que déjame ver lo que teníamos acá porque medio lo iba aquí registrando. Considering repressive tolerance, considering this radical individualism, uh, could uh, could it be related with this individualism and repressive tolerance? Can they be related with the emergence of some authoritarian practices and thoughts in our days? Is it related the individualism, radical individualism, and repressive tolerance with this authoritarian, uh, the rising of authoritarian thought and practices?
So authoritarianism, repressive tolerance, and individual, how they're related.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Well, the individual, notice, I think at some point in the presentation, I made a distinction between the metaphysical individual and the concrete individual, right? And so quite often when we talk about the individual in Western societies, especially in capitalist societies, it is a metaphysical individual, right? Individual in general, an individual separate from any particularity, right? And so we have this idea of the individual, the free individual, and that is an individual that's detached from the social realities of life, right? And it allows you to make a lot of claims about the individual, this general individual, that really aren't experienced by concrete, real, live individuals living human life in a concrete situation, right? And I think quite often that's one of the mechanisms that sort of, how would I put it, that interferes with democratic discourse, right? Because quite often in capitalist societies, We attempt to have discourses about people and the individuals without actually addressing the concrete individuals and concrete situations. We overgeneralize, right? And at the same time, the real concrete individual is suffering from various forms of repression. And as a result of that, is not the free individual that Western societies like to talk about in a very abstract, metaphysical way. Does that make sense?
Ya, como dado que Breve preguntaba sobre el vínculo entre este individualismo radical y la emergencia del autoritarismo, pues la respuesta del profesor Farr es que en algún momento de su intervención él mencionaba esta división de un individuo abstracto y un individuo concreto y que señalaba que en el mundo capitalista, ah, mm, tenemos que discutir acerca de, sobre los individuos concretos, ¿no? Y que a veces tendemos a generalizar, ¿no? Que hay una excesiva generalización de las existencias individuales concretas. Entonces, pues, justo sugiere que el discurso autoritario precisamente se basa en esas generalizaciones y simplificaciones de los individuos concretos. Ujú.
I
Sí.
see a question by Marcelo in the chat, and I want to address that. I'm not sure if I understand all of the question, but I do want to address the part about, let's see if I can find it here. Um, I'm from Marcuse on liberal democracy, right? Um, and a certain kind of ethic, taking responsibility for oneself. Yeah, so actually, when I was preparing this presentation, I read but didn't include it. I was going to include it, but the paper was getting too long. Um, an essay by Marcuse called The Struggle Against Liberalism and the Totalitarian View of the State, where he does this critique of liberalism. But I didn't include that in this presentation. But it will probably, as I develop this for the book, I'll include that. But both Farm and Marcuse are critical of traditional liberalism. Traditional liberalism, again, is one of those ideas that's connected to the idea of human freedom, human emancipation, and that kind of thing. But Marcuse makes the point in this essay that what has happened is the freedom of the individual in liberalism uh, has been replaced with the freedom of the market, right? And so it's not the individual that's free, it's the market, right? And again, even there in the context of talking about individual freedom in a liberal context, there's liberalism, but then liberalism as it's transformed into neoliberalism, where now the individual is replaced by the corporation, right? Corporations are people too. I don't know if anybody in Mexico had the audacity to say something that ignorant, but they have in the U.S. and politicians have run on that kind of platform. These politicians that support big corporations, the corporations are people too, right? And so the corporation ought to have all the rights that an individual person should have and should be treated like an individual person. And so in liberalism, the individual in the philosophy of liberalism is very slippery, right? Now, let me say one more thing about liberalism too, because I just finished teaching John Stuart Mill on liberty in one of my classes, and now I'm teaching Kant after him, right? So two big champions of liberalism in the Western philosophical tradition. Um, One of my favorite thinkers, Charles Mills, who does philosophy of race and is also a Marxist, passed away a few years ago. But at one of the Marcuse conferences, this was 2011, we were at the University of Pennsylvania, and Angela Davis was there to give one of our keynote speeches. And she sat in on the session uh, where Charles gave a paper. The title of his paper was "Can Liberalism Be Radical?" And his answer was yes. And Angela disagreed with that. And there's an interesting, fascinating exchange between he and Angela on the question, can liberalism be radical? But I love Angela to death. And 99.9% of the time, I'm in agreement with Angela. But this is the one time I kind of agreed with Charles because I understood Charles's point. And Charles and I have been friends for a while. And I've heard, uh, other papers with this in this kind of spirit. And his point was that the ideals and ideas of liberalism are correct. There's nothing wrong with those ideas and ideals. The problem is they've not come to fruition in Western society. And we act as if they've come to fruition, and they've not. So, what has to happen is the institutions of Western society has to be restructured in such a way that our best ideals can actually come to fruition and not just be ideas in our heads. Right. And so I think about liberalism in that way too, right? And especially when you're thinking about the ideas that's been bequeathed to us by some of the great thinkers in our tradition, even though they had several problems of their own in recognizing some persons as persons. They still have some fascinating ideas that I think have not come to fruition, right? Because we tend to think about individuals and not social structures. Right? We're sort of conditioned not to think in terms of social structures and how they work. Right?
Okay, thank you. La pregunta de Marcelo acá en el chat era, y déjenme, si quieren, la comento. Está muy interesado en la discusión entre Fromm y Marcuse en torno a la democracia liberal y cierto tipo de ética de la responsabilidad relacionada con hacerse cargo de uno mismo, ¿no? Algo que aparece de modos diferentes en Escape from Freedom, y tal vez también en Nombre Unidimensional o en Ensayos sobre la Liberación. Me pregunto si podría decirnos algo más sobre esto y si detrás del horizonte de la democracia surge, que surge sin opresión, también hay algo de un ideal de una cierta autenticidad del individuo. Y bueno, la respuesta del profesor Farr giraba en torno, que decía que no estaba seguro si entendió bien la pregunta, pero que decía que en su texto había pensado incorporar justamente el tema o el problema del liberalismo y que planea hacerlo en una versión final, pero señalaba que Ay, déjenme ver la nota que tenía acá. Que el problema, bueno, primero señalaba una condición muy peculiar sobre el liberalismo que se ha convertido en el neoliberalismo, y el problema es que lejos de buscar que los individuos sean libres en el hecho, en la realidad concreta del neoliberalismo, son las corporaciones las que son libres y no los individuos, ¿no? Comentaba que incluso en Estados Unidos se ha dado el caso de quienes sostienen que también las corporaciones son personas, ¿no? Y él decía que probablemente en otros contextos nadie se atrevería a decir algo así, ¿no? Pero que esto lleva a una pues reflexión muy interesante sobre el liberalismo, porque, bueno, decía también en algún momento que en realidad los ideales del liberalismo, pues digamos, tienen sentido, son correctos. El problema sería, o lo que habría que criticar es el considerar que de hecho ya están cumplidos en la realidad, ¿no? Es decir, un individuo libre en todos los sentidos, no solo económicos, y el tema es entonces buscar el cumplimiento de ese liberalismo, ¿no? De esos ideales. También comentaba el caso de una ocasión en un debate en el que Angela Davis y, sorry, I don't remember the name of the other philosopher it
Oh,
was, Charles.
Charles Mills. Uh-huh.
Charles Mills, yeah, thank you. Decía que Charles Mills y Angela Davis debatían en algún momento sobre si podía haber un liberalismo radical, que la respuesta de Angela Davis era que no, y el profesor Farr decía que, aunque por supuesto el 99.9% de las veces está de acuerdo con Angela Davis, decía que en esta ocasión había un punto interesante en el argumento de, de Mills, aunque I lost the main idea of the argument, of the Mills argument, it was about liberalism. Why is
Yeah,
possible radical liberalism?
his argument is that liberalism has given us all the right ideas and ideals. The
Ah, yeah,
problem is that they've not come to fruition, right?
yeah.
And our institutions need to be restructured in such a way that these ideals can come to fruition.
Sí, ok, sí, estaba relacionado con esto de que en el argumento de Mills, pues el liberalismo en realidad no se ha cumplido y que hay que buscar reestructurar las instituciones para que se cumplan esos ideales del liberalismo. Ujú. Bien, thank you very much, Professor. I don't know if there is time for a last in short question. ¿Alguien tiene una última pregunta o comentario?
I do want to say one thing, one more
Yeah,
thing. I
please.
noticed in the last part of Marcelo's question about authenticity for the individual.
Mm.
Fromm does address that to some extent. Fromm's book, Man for Himself. So what I would do is read 3 books by Fromm. I would start with Escape from Freedom, The Sane Society, and then Man for Himself. And Man for Himself is where he gives more of a positive answer to where we need to go with all of this. There's still heavy critique at the first, but it's kind of it's his ethics in a way.
Sí, sobre esta última parte de la pregunta de Marcelo sobre de un ideal de autenticidad en el ser humano, nos comentaba el profesor Farr que retomando los estudios de Fromm, eh, señalaba que sí, que desde la perspectiva de Fromm se da una perspectiva más positiva acerca de esta libertad, pero que tiene al final de cuentas un sentido ético, ¿no? Me parece. Ujú. Sí. Bueno, well, thank you very much, Professor, for your conversation, for your experience. We are very pleased to have the chance to talk with you. And so maybe it's late here, maybe for
Yeah.
you too. We hope that you have a good rest tonight. So, but thank you
Yeah, you're welcome. And thank
very,
you
very
guys. I
much.
had a great time and thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this.
Thank you. Les agradecemos también a todo nuestro público. Muchas gracias al profesor Farr por haber estado acá. And we hope it's not the last time. We
Yeah,
hope we expect to have another chance to have a conversation with you. Thanks a lot,
I would
professor.
love that. Thank you. Goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye. Buenas noches a todas y todos. Hasta la próxima.
Ya está la transcripción, la mando al correo donde nos hicieron la invitación hoy, ¿no? ¿Y ustedes la reparten?
Por favor, sí. Ah, bueno, aprovechamos para hacer este anuncio que Hilda nos hizo favor de transcribir ahí con un apoyo tecnológico la
La
conferencia de
sesión.
hoy. Sí, así que se las haremos llegar posteriormente también.
Bueno, muchas gracias.
A ustedes, hasta luego.
Gracias, César.
A ti.